The issue that's really coming out now is the issue of schizophrenia. And the reason is this has really come to the fore with the high potency marijuana that's being sold in dispensaries. You know, when I was a kid and we smoked pot, it was 1 or 2% THC. Now you can get 15, 20, 25%. You can get pure THC. And it works very, very differently, so I'm told. I don't really want to find out. So when I talk about schizophrenia, we talk about psychosis. Some studies call it psychosis, schizophrenia. They talk about schizophrenia-like illnesses. It really is, I think, the worst of all the non-fatal diseases because it starts in the late teens or early 20s, and it just destroys people's lives. It permanently deranges their thinking. You know, if you work with this, you know. They're dependent on medicine. They're dependent on their community mental health center. They rarely have full-time jobs, rarely married, rarely have their own home. The cause of schizophrenia is synaptic pruning gone awry. This is not proved, but it's considered pretty likely, which is why it occurs in the late teens. And marijuana interferes with neural pruning. So marijuana has a horrible effect on schizophrenia. And anybody who works with schizophrenics has seen this. When they use marijuana, they really decompensate. And that's because marijuana actually imitates the process that causes schizophrenia. So there's three things that we see with schizophrenic patients. One is if they already have schizophrenia, pot will make them worse. The other is that people who use marijuana develop schizophrenia 2 to 3 years younger on the average than people who don't use pot. And now there's enough evidence that marijuana actually causes schizophrenia in people who would not have developed it otherwise. This one's been controversial. So let's go over these. Schizophrenic patients who use marijuana, they are less likely to take their medicine. They're more likely to drop out of treatment. They're more likely to end up hospitalized. The United States spends over $1 billion a year on schizophrenic hospitalizations caused by marijuana. This one report said about half the expense of hospitalizing schizophrenics is due to marijuana, and that was done years ago, probably worse today. So I really I always tell patients with schizophrenia, you got it, absolutely don't use it. No drugs, no alcohol, and you'll stay functioning. Okay, second, marijuana users develop schizophrenia earlier, and this was a meta-analysis that was done. They took all the different studies and used really strict ways of combining the data, and what they found is marijuana users were diagnosed 2 or 3 years younger, especially the heaviest users. Alcohol did not have any such effect. So the big question is, does marijuana cause schizophrenia? And actually, when I wrote the book, I said, we don't know. I was really wrong at the time. We did know, but the evidence wasn't as strong as it is now. Although the biggest study came out, this is a study from 1987. It was a huge study. It was 50,000 military conscripts in Sweden, and they just happened to have the data on them. So somebody looked through it. And what they found is the marijuana users were more likely to, people who use marijuana, it's the same story. The people who use marijuana before the age of 18 were more likely to develop schizophrenia later in life. The heaviest users were 6 times more likely. Well, then they went back and they controlled for all those third factors, those confounding factors. They looked at socioeconomic status, a family history of schizophrenia, and it still came out. The heaviest users were 3 times more likely to develop schizophrenia. And the World Psychiatric Congress came out recently and just said there's enough evidence cannabis use during puberty is a major risk factor for developing schizophrenia. In London, they said the high potency cannabis was involved in 24% of all first episode psychosis. And I find now that I know what it is, I read Alex Berenson's book, but he really describes it. Now that I know what it is, I realize I see this all the time. And I'm going to go over it. There's a future slide. Go over the difference. Anyway, the arguments against the development of schizophrenia are, well, then why aren't we seeing a whole lot more of this? And I asked a researcher about this, and she says, how do we know? We don't keep count. It's all estimates. In Denmark, where they do keep count, there's been a 30% increase in schizophrenia or in psychosis. And ER visits for first psychosis have gone up in this country. And the other argument is that, well, it's a third factor that causes this. Genetics, the same genetics that cause schizophrenia also cause people to use marijuana. So that's what's doing it. And that's pretty much been proved wrong with the studies on the high potency weed, because what we found is it's the people who use the really high potency marijuana that are way more likely to develop psychosis. And the genetics don't predispose them to choose that. They choose that because it's available. When it wasn't available in the world, nobody used it. As it's become more available, people are using it. So both of these arguments against it are pretty much gone. The high-potency marijuana, skunk weed, it's a hybrid between sativa and indica. People use skunk. This is research, hard for me to read this, done in 2009, 2015, British Journal of Psychiatry and Lancet. People who use high-potency marijuana, 4 to 5 times more likely to develop psychosis. And a lot of the psychosis goes on to be schizophrenia. And the ones who develop psychosis are the ones who have used more than 5 years, but especially who used daily and who use the really high-potency marijuana, which is not what you get in dispensaries. The dispensary marijuana is much higher potency than stuff that people bought from Mexico. And this is just the graph they showed. Of all the people who developed psychosis, the one in red is the ones using high potency. Of all the people who didn't develop psychosis, the majority were the people not using high potency marijuana. So we've actually created a new illness. And like I said, I see this at work. And you all who work with people with schizophrenia can probably realize you've been seeing this. And here's the difference. When you see somebody with conventional schizophrenia, they have those typical symptoms of disorganized thought, loose associations, tangential thinking, whereas marijuana-induced schizophrenia, their thought is more organized. Conventional schizophrenia, more denial, a lot more resistance to medication. I find my patients who developed it in the midst of smoking marijuana never fight me on medicine. They tell me the diagnosis right up front. The bizarre delusions we normally saw in schizophrenia, thought withdrawal, thought broadcasting, thinking other people can read my thoughts. I don't see those in the people with marijuana-induced schizophrenia. The biggest difference is, it used to be my big diagnostic thing for people with schizophrenia is I just felt weird talking to them. It's like they're relating to a different dimension, and I'm not in that dimension. And that's how it feels. With people with marijuana-induced schizophrenia, it feels like they're all there. And the other thing is people with more traditional schizophrenia had true paranoia. People with marijuana-induced schizophrenia, it's more that they're quarrelsome and antagonistic as opposed to really paranoid. I also find they're really attached to marijuana, and I tell them this caused your disease, and they don't hear, and they don't want to quit. And I've seen a lot of these people. I see about 1 or 2 a month, and often the story is they first used marijuana like at 11 or 12, and then developed schizophrenia within a few years later, and they never put the two together. The teenagers who are genetically predisposed to schizophrenia because it runs in their family are, of course, especially vulnerable. How many teenagers check their family history before trying marijuana? I sure didn't. And if schizophrenia runs in your family, do you really want somebody telling your teenager that pot is safer than alcohol? Probably not. But really committed marijuana users are in denial. It can't hurt me. It's only weed. And this is an article that showed up in High Times magazine. Smoke weed and don't worry about schizophrenia. It's this unshakable belief that marijuana can't hurt anyone.